Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Salesforce Ben collaboration, this time in partnership with Salesforce itself. A very exciting presentation we've got coming for you today, and I know you'll all be as eager to get stuck in as I am, but we'll just wait a couple of minutes for everyone to join. But in the meantime, please let me know where you're joining from. I'd love to see what global audience we have today. I'm based just outside of London, and it's summertime, so I just can't deal with it. But yeah, let me know in the comments where you're joining from, and we'll get kicked off in a couple of minutes. I hope to see a lot of you at Dreamforce this year. Looking forward to that one, so that'll be great. So yeah, let us know where you're joining from. Perfect. So we'll just give it a couple minutes. Oh, hi from Dallas, Texas. They're all coming in. Hi from Bangladesh. Thank you all for joining. Wow, I can't keep up with all of these comments. Great. I love to see what global audience we have, and I love to see how excited you all are for this LinkedIn Live event. So we'll just give it a couple more seconds, and then we'll get things kicked off. Hello from Switzerland. Hi from Mumbai, India. Perfect. Well, we'll get things started now. So I just want to say thank you for everyone for joining today. We're really excited to talk to you about Well-Architects, a secret weapon that needs to be an arsenal in every Salesforce professional's life. So we just have a few things to go over first before you can get kicked off. This is a LinkedIn Live. It will be recorded. It will be posted on our LinkedIn and our YouTube. So if you need to drop off or you'd like to share it with your colleagues, that's no problem at all. That's where you'll find it. All lines are muted, but don't worry. If you have any burning questions, just pop them in the comments and Susanna and I will be going over them later in a live Q&A. Perfect. So now we'll just do some introductions. So my name's Aoife. I am the Events and Webinar Coordinator at Salesforce Ben, and I am very pleased to be joined with Susanna today. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Susanna Plaisted, and I'm an architect evangelist at Salesforce.
Thank you, Susanna. It's lovely to have you here today. Well, I'm going to hand over to you now, and I'm going to drop off, but I shall see you all at the end for our Q&A.
Sounds good. Thank you. So hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. And I'm very excited to be sharing a little bit about Salesforce Well-Architected with you. So we are going to kick it off with a little bit about what Salesforce Well-Architected is. So maybe put in the chat if you've heard of Salesforce Well-Architected before, or if you've used it. Would love to hear about it. But for those of you who have not heard about Well-Architected, what it is prescriptive guidance. It's resources and it's tools, all to help you architect Salesforce in the right way. So it was released in August of 2022, and all of the information, all the guidance, all of the tools that we are going to review today are available on architect.salesforce.com. And it is on architect.salesforce.com, but as we said at the beginning, it's not just for architects. I think all Trailblazers, all folks, whether you're an admin or a developer, or an architect, can learn a lot from this resource. So let's get into it. Okay, so we created Salesforce Well-Architected for one really important reason, and that reason is that it can be difficult to understand if there are things that are in common across different Salesforce implementations that indicate whether or not it's going to be a healthy and a long-lasting solution. And that's difficult because every implementation is different. We know that every customer is different, that they use a different mix of products. And what we realized after talking with a lot of architects and a lot of folks inside Salesforce, so Salesforce Well-Architected wasn't written by my team at Salesforce, the Salesforce Architects team. It was written in collaboration with us, but it is all of the guidance from folks in our engineering teams, folks who actually look under the hood at what's happening inside Salesforce when you use it. Also, a lot of our really seasoned architects and professional services, and also folks in the Trailblazer community as well, are folks who are working at big implementation partners, some ISV partners. So it represents a lot of sort of best practices that used to be only garnered from like tribal knowledge, right? Like you had to sort of work on a project, you had to maybe work with a mentor to really get this information. But we realized that, at Salesforce, core values are really key to everything that we do. And we believed that we could implement core values for architecture for Salesforce projects that can help guide you to a successful implementation. So, let's look at what we call the well-architected framework, which is essentially those core values in order that you can apply to your work. So, this is the well-architected framework on the screen. And again, it's how to step through your essentially the way you solve problems with Salesforce. So you can see that there's three main pillars, and these are trusted, easy, and adaptable. And then within those three pillars, there's different, what I usually refer to as behaviors. So it's how a system should act if it is to be trusted, how a system should act if it's easy, and how a system should act if it's adaptable. And everything on the screen and everything inside Salesforce Well-Architected is actually in priority order. So, Salesforce's number one company value is trust. And so it's probably no surprise that one of our key value for Well-Architected is trusted. Then we go into easy, and this one, we'll talk about it when we dive in just a second, but this one I think is really unique to Salesforce. And then adaptability, also important. And one of the things I do just want to point out at the beginning is that just because things are in priority order, that doesn't mean you can choose to do one thing or another. We're not saying like, oh, just focus on the left-hand side of the screen and you can maybe ignore the things on the right. Really, prioritization comes in handy when you have to make a hard decision because of limited resources, maybe like time or funding. It's at that point where maybe you need to make a trade-off. But I think a great example is at Salesforce, we prioritize every year and we prioritize our products, right? How we're going to invest our time and our resources. And just because we prioritize, maybe this is just an example, just because we prioritize maybe Service Cloud above Sales Cloud or AI Cloud above Service Cloud, that doesn't mean we're going to stop working on those other products. We're still going to do that, but just maybe we're going to direct our resources a little bit different for a finite period of time. Okay, so let's double click into each of these and explore what type of information you can expect to find in Salesforce Well-Architected inside. We'll start with the trusted pillar. Okay, so trust is maybe a little bit of a big topic. So I think it's helpful to describe exactly what we mean when we say trusted. So for us, trusted solutions protect the business and the stakeholders that we work for. And they do that by being secure, which means you control access and protect your data by doing three main things. So the first is your organizational security. So this is topics like authentication and authorization. How are you going to control how folks actually access your system? And inside Well-Architected, you can see the link down below at this Well-Architected/trusted white paper. So all of the information in Well-Architected is organized in a series of white papers that are really dense technical documents that have lots of guidance. And so, for instance, we have a set of patterns and anti-patterns for what you should do and what you should avoid around authentication and around authorization, all within that organizational security section. And once folks are logged in, once they have the access that they need, we want to manage how their sessions work. So how long should a session last? How do you want to handle your session timeouts? Do you need elevated sessions for things like downloading large reports, for example? So you have lots of best practices there. We also have data security, and this is like hot topic with Salesforce, right? There's so many levers to control who sees what inside Salesforce. So we have some opinionated guidance. This is a good reminder that Salesforce Well-Architected, right, is another resource for Salesforce. There's so many resources for Salesforce nowadays. There's Trailhead, there's Salesforce Ben, there's all of our help documentation. And what makes Salesforce Well-Architected a little bit different is the fact that this is Salesforce's stance, an opinionated stance on some topics. So we give examples like, make sure that you're not just, for data security, make sure that you're not just marking every object or org by default as private without thinking twice about it. So make sure you have a reason to mark those objects as OWD of private. So we have lots of different opinions on each of these topics, and that's really what makes this different from like a Trailhead or from a help doc that just gives you all the ways you could do something, and then you have to make up that decision of what's the right choice. So moving on, in trusted, we talked about secure, and next is compliance. And this is a really hot topic, especially with all the AI buzz out there. How are you going to handle ethical standards with all these new tools and features? Also, of course, a topic that we've talked about for a long time, which is legal adherence, whether, you're dealing with the locality that you're in. If you're in the UK, for example, you have different legal regulations than in the US. And then also within the industry that you work in. So if you work in healthcare or finance, you have different regulations you need to adhere to. And that's the responsibility of architects as well. It's not just, something that the legal team can work out on their own. We need to make sure we're proactively reaching out. And then finally, accessibility. So we have guidelines on how you should handle and configure your solution to make sure that it's accessible to users of all abilities. And then the final white paper within inside the trusted pillar of Salesforce Well-Architected is reliable. So when we say reliable, we mean that a solution is going to operate efficiently and dependably, even when there's things like lots of volumes of data or maybe lots of transactions from lots of different users. So inside this topic, we think about things like availability. So making sure that your system is available. And that's not just a Salesforce responsibility. It's really a shared responsibility between Salesforce and folks who build on top of Salesforce, because the customizations you make can impact how available your system is, right? Based on volumes, based on how you write your code, for example. And then we think about things like performance. So how is your system going to respond if there's lots of data, if there's lots of transactions? How is the latency of your system? And is that acceptable to your users? How is the latency going to work? And then finally, scalability. So are you doing things like running scale tests? Are you making sure that your system is bulkified for operations at scale? So we have a lot of best practices, a lot of resources and tools around that as well. So this is sort of the map, like the layout of Salesforce Well-Architected for Trusted. And we're going to go and do a demo in just a little bit, but this is what you can expect to see in the different areas of the trusted pillar of Salesforce Well-Architected. Okay, and now let's dive into easy. So this one is my favorite. I think this is important because there's a reason why all of our employers, all of the customers that we're working for have chosen Salesforce instead of just building a custom application, because they could have definitely done that, right? And gotten a pixel perfect experience and have all the features exactly like they want it. But they chose Salesforce because they can move faster and they can actually use some of the great built-in features that have been tested across industries, across organizations. So for this, we talk about how to make sure that your solution is delivering that business value again, business value fast. We do that through being simple, automated, and engaging. So when we say simple, we don't mean that your job as an architect is simple or that your solution is necessarily like really basic or anything like that. What we mean is that your solution should follow in the most direct path in engineering. So you shouldn't, for example, force something into a flow just because we say that flow is great, which it is. But if you can do it within a couple lines of code and it's going to take you like this crazy amount of work to shove it into a flow, that's not the most direct path in engineering. And because you're doing what I would maybe consider like a hacky solution or sometimes people think it's like inventive or creative, but sometimes if you're honest with yourself, you're being, maybe it's clever, but is it actually easy to maintain? Is it easy for folks to understand what you did? And that's really important to designing a simple solution that's going to last. Needs to be maintainable, needs to be readable. So making sure that it's maybe you have great documentation, not just code comments, but solution overviews and architectural decision records, things like that. Okay, then when we move into automation, so automated solutions meet goals and objectives faster and at scale. And they do this by having clear logic. So you don't just automate a bad business process, right? That's actually going to exacerbate the problem. You make sure that you have a great process first, that the logic is clear. And then you think about how you're going to use all the amazing automation tools we have to maintain data integrity across your integration, or across your automation, excuse me. You want to make sure that you're not introducing issues with data, maybe issues with managing how maybe your flow is operating in system or user context. You want to make sure you understand those pieces. And then finally, business value. So I would argue that this is maybe higher priority, right? Everything is in priority, but business value is key? Are you measuring KPIs? Are you making sure that this automation that you invested in is actually delivering value to the business? Okay, and then finally for easy, we have this engaging pillar. So sometimes architects, especially I'm going to call it developers a little bit, and you can argue with me in the chat if you want. But sometimes we think about delivering a solution where like I'm going to build it, and then it's up to the business user to like actually live with it. And like I don't necessarily think about that part. And that's actually an anti-pattern. We all need to be worried about how usable a solution is, because again, all of this is about delivering value to the business. That's why we're all here. That's why we all have jobs. So if you even if you have the most beautiful flow or most like clever line of code or most inventive architecture, if no one's using the solution that you build, that it's not delivering value. So you need to make sure that you're delivering a solution that's streamlined, so that's easy and intuitive for folks to use, and that's also helping them do whatever is important to them at their job better. So you have lots of patterns, anti-patterns, and guidance for all of these topics in the easy pillar of well-architected. Okay. And then finally, we're going to talk about adaptability. And this is like the maybe a little more abstract sometimes than things like scale and automation, but it's really important because once we have a trusted solution that's delivering value, the fact of the matter is that the business is always changing, right? There's especially a lot of change that's happening in the ecosystem right now. So how is your solution going to evolve with the changes that are inevitable, that are just going to come? And we do that by talking about things like resilience. So is your solution going to handle change well? Sometimes when we think about change, right, we think about maybe those unexpected things that happen. We always want to prepare for incidents, maybe corruption, think about things like backup and restore and business continuity. But the most common change that can actually cause the most disruption are things that happen by the job that we all do as admins, developers, and architects, which is to introduce new customizations and new changes to the platform. And if you don't have a great application lifecycle management system in place or set of procedures or philosophy, then you are going to have a higher risk of introducing regressions into your application. And so having really strong ALM practices is really important to having a resilient solution. And then finally, so wrapping up, this is our eighth pillar, our eighth white paper. We talk about composability, and composable solutions adjust quickly and with greater stability. So as Salesforce has matured, I think over the years, folks are using this platform for more business critical applications, which is great. But that means that there's more pressure, there's more oversight that's needed to make sure that the work that we're doing is going to operate no matter what, right? When these are business critical applications, maybe like emergency call center or a hospital or even a financial institution, how do you make sure that we can make changes and adjust, but not break what is happening, not break solutions that are working? And so we can do that by making sure we have good separation of concerns. So making sure that we don't have a tightly coupled system that's really dependent on things maybe in a particular environment, for example. We also think about things like interoperability. So making sure that the way that your metadata and the solution that you have can be swapped in and out, maybe within an org or maybe even across orgs if you're in a multi-org situation. And then finally, we think about packageability. So this does not mean that you should or everyone should use packages. So things like second generation packaging or unlocked packages. Maybe you do. That's a very stable release mechanism, but it also has a lot of overhead. It can be pretty complex to break up your solution into those modular packages. But even if you don't use packaging, we recommend in our opinionated guidance and well-architected that you adopt a bit of a packaging mindset. So you take the time to understand the metadata in your org and understand which business units are using what. Are there shared pieces of functionality in your system? And again, this is just going to help you not introduce those regressions as you change and evolve with the business. Okay, so this was a lot. This was a lot of information, and this was sort of your roadmap inside Well-Architected. But now we're going to, I think, take a look. Oh, maybe one more slide before we hop into our demo. So, what we're going to look at in the demo is the actual series of white papers that's available on architect.salesforce.com. And again, these white papers show this prescriptive guidance, are patterns, things to follow, things to avoid, and also relevant tools. So with that, let's actually, instead of going into the slide, we're going to dive right into the demo because I think that's a little more, it's easy to understand what's happening with the demo. And sometimes people ask, are people using this today? Are people actually leveraging Well-Architected? And this is some feedback that we've gotten. Definitely, it's a living document. It's going to continue to evolve and improve. And I'll show you some areas where we're evolving it right now. But this is, I think, a great piece of feedback that we're sort of on the right track. Okay, so now we're going to break into our demo. Cool. Okay, so we are at architect.salesforce.com, and you can see that there is a whole little banner here where I can click Get Started with Well-Architected, or I can go up here to this Well-Architected header, and I can see an overview. So if I click in here, and that's where the Get Started button would take you as well. What you're going to see is a lot of what we just covered. So this introduction of the purpose of Well-Architected, of our 3 pillars of trust, easy, and adaptable. But then if we keep scrolling down or hop over to this link over here, what you're going to see is the topics and all of the white papers. So this is like when I first started getting familiar with Well-Architected, or when I'm introducing someone to this, I think that this is a really great place to start because you don't have to remember the taxonomy essentially of Well-Architected, like what's inside each of the pillars or what subjects are inside each of the white papers, because you have this sort of cheat sheet right here. So for instance, if I was thinking about how do I manage organizational security, I can see right away that it's inside the secure pillar. So with that, let's look at what one of these well-architected white papers actually looks like. So here I am in the secure white paper, and I can see that this is a lot of content. It's not like it's not like bite-sized modular trailhead content. It's a little bit different. There's a different tone as well. Um, we got feedback, and if there are architects on the line, you might have heard this as well. That Trailhead is amazing. We love Trailhead, but sometimes it's not the right tone for maybe some of your senior executives, maybe a CIO on your team. You want to make sure that folks understand that Salesforce is fun, it's amazing, but it's also a serious application. So these white papers have a little bit of a different tone. There's not the fun animals in most places. They pop up in one place that I'll show you, but for the most part, it's a bit of dense technical documentation. But I'm going to show you how to hop in and out and get some quick insights. So this is our introduction. All the white papers have a similar format. So there's the introduction to the topic, like secure. Then we have our sort of subsections or our behaviors. So organizational security, for example, session security. And if I hop into one of these, you can see that we have this opinionated guidance or sort of things to consider when you're thinking about organizational security. So signs that you might have issues with that topic. For example, if you have ad hoc processes to activate or deactivate users, or unclear steps to update authorization for individual users when they change roles. Like these are warning signs that maybe you need to think about how to refactor your implementation. But we have more than that. We also have really sort of deep sections on things like, for example, for organizational security, we talk about authentication, sort of why it's important. And then our opinionated stances. So these are in the bullets right here. So things like you should only create Salesforce users based on individuals and not personas. Again, this is not like earth-shattering, like new news, but it's never been written down in a place where you can refer to it other than maybe I think it's in the terms and conditions for Salesforce. But if you need to refer to this information, it's now sort of documented in one place for you as an architect or an admin or a developer. We also have opinions about sessions, about password policies, things like that. But what I think my favorite part is, and what we've heard is the most used part of Well-Architected, are these patterns and anti-patterns. So I can see for authentication, for instance, things that I should look for. So what should I look for in my design standards and in my documentation? And here in the patterns, they're the things that if I see, that's good. That's things that I want to be seeing. And then the reverse of that. So if I see something in my design standards over here in the anti-patterns, those are things I don't want to see. Those are things I want to avoid and things I might need to refactor. So we have that for your design standards, also in your org. So inside Salesforce itself, what should I look for to know that I'm configuring authentication in a way that's healthy, that's going to be good for my users? And then we also get really specific. So we talk about not just in your org at a high level, but what should you see in your Lightning Web Components or in your Apex that's good, or what should you not see, hopefully, or maybe need to refactor? And this is the area of well-architected that's going to continue to evolve and grow as we get more specific and more detailed patterns and anti-patterns. So definitely keep looking in this area. And we're actually working on ways to make it easier to access these anti-patterns when you're in the flow of work. So instead of having to dig into the white papers, we are looking at different ways to surface those. So if you're tuning into Dreamforce to the Architect keynote, definitely keep your ears open for some of those developments. Okay, so each of the sections follow a really similar pattern, but what I do want to call out is down here, we have two sections. One is the tools relevant to whatever topic we're looking at. So, for example, here, relative to security, I can see that for data security, for example, I might want to look into Apex Crypto Class to encrypt and decrypt my data if I'm using Apex. And if I want to know more about that, I can click into this, and this is going to pop open um, some developer documentation that's going to tell me exactly how I need to configure that. So if I go back to my white paper, you can see other things like that. So if I need API access control, for example, that actually cuts across all of the topics of secure, I can drill into that. So you have lots of different, so this is essentially, if you know you need to improve, for example, your data security, these are the different levers, the different tools you have inside Salesforce that you can configure to improve your data security, for example. And then for folks who are maybe newer or learning or want to dig really deep into a particular area, I would definitely recommend looking at the resources relevant to the topic. So, for instance, if you just want to learn more about data security, for example, you can click here into this guide to sharing architecture. And this is actually a really great resource on like a deep dive on everything you need to know about sharing, and it's always up to date with the most recent release. And one note maybe to make here is that everything you see in both of these tables that we were looking at are Salesforce official resources. So there's no third-party resources. It's all stuff that you can trust a little bit more than just a Google search. And then the other thing, just to point out about the resources section, which I think is pretty cool, we also have templates. So in the first table that we looked at, it said maybe anti-patterns was the fact that you don't have design standards. That was one of the anti-patterns that exists. So you might see that and then think, okay, well, how do I even get started with design standards? And to answer that question, we have a template that you can leverage. And this isn't the only template. We have all different types of templates that you can use. And a lot of these are essentially either something that you can download in a PDF, or what I think is pretty cool is that you can open it in Quip if you're using Quip and actually use this template. So you can see it's going to allow me to save it as my own document so that I can type in my own stuff. So I can see that there's guiding principles. These are like suggestions to start with, but then you can write in your own, for example, additional definitions for your organization, your own naming conventions, but here are some example naming conventions that you might want to use for Apex, for example. So all of these resources, again, part of Well-Architected, but hopefully that can help you improve your implementation. Even if you're just starting out, it's going to give you some resources to get you going. And then the last thing I'll point out in this white paper tour is this feedback section. So definitely let us know what you think. If we are missing a pattern or an anti-pattern, if you have questions, the best place to give us feedback is into the survey here. And it's not just going into, I don't know, into a central Salesforce repository somewhere. It is going directly to my team. So we do read all of these survey submissions. So definitely continue to tell us what you think. Okay, so one other thing to just demo while we're over here. When we started writing Well-Architected, we realized that we had made some assumptions about knowledge that folks maybe have as they're working on the platform. But when we were sort of challenged by that, we realized, well, we can't make those assumptions, right? We don't want to make assumptions. That's never a good thing. So we have two papers that are inside our resources section, inside a little subsection called Architecture Fundamentals. So the first one is called Architecture Basics. So this might be a good resource if you are either transitioning to Salesforce from another technology, like if you were maybe an architect but working with, I don't know, SAP, for example. There's a lot of differences, right? You might know how to architect things in a very maybe in an abstract sense, like what are good enterprise architecture patterns, what are just some good technical best practices for technical teams. But Salesforce is a little bit different, right? It's a multi-tenant architecture. There are things that just don't apply to other technologies that you need to know with Salesforce. An example of that are things like execution context. So if you don't know, for example, like things like transactional limits. So what are the limits, those great governor limits we need to operate underneath? And then what happens when you save a record to the database? We have a whole built-in order of execution. And we have this great, so I mentioned there is one place on the architect or on the well-architected section of architect.salesforce.com that has Ruth, our fun character. She pops up here in the order of execution overview. So this is a great document. This is updated. I know there's lots of great resources floating around on the web. I think the challenge is that you don't know what's been updated when. Salesforce has 3 releases a year. So how do you know if you're looking at the most up-to-date stuff? This order of execution overview is updated whenever we have a release. So this is the source of truth for order of execution. And I think I'm not sharing it. So let me make sure that I'm sharing it. Here's the order of execution diagram that I was just talking about. And if I pop back over to my architecture basics, the other topics that we cover here are things like metadata versus data. Again, maybe basic for some folks, but really, really important. It's important to know like what's copied from production into sandboxes. Data, yes. Metadata, yes. Data, no. And sort of what's possible with all, or how does data versus metadata behave in these different scenarios? Okay, so the last thing that I'll highlight are platform APIs. If you're not familiar with the APIs, we link out resources to it. And of course, we have some text here around limits because that's really, really important. The other thing that I want to point out on the website is the platform multi-tenant architecture paper. So this is a resource. The first instance of it. Okay, hold on. My computer is asking me if I want to patch something right now, which I do not want to do. So the first resource is the platform multi-tenant architecture. Again, so this is a great resource that existed maybe around 2015, the original paper. It was on the developer blog back in the day, written by a gentleman named Steve Bobrowski. And this paper was essentially almost a defense of cloud, a cloud architecture using a cloud platform, essentially. This is back when people didn't really trust the cloud. So they were like, well, tell me how it works. What's this multi-tenant architecture you're talking about? How can I know that my data is secure? And to help create sort of a defensive stance on this and to educate folks on how the multi-tenant architecture is actually structured, this was written. As part of the Well-Architected release back in August of 2022, we revamped this platform multi-tenant architecture paper, added a bunch of additional information, some great diagrams, and updated it with some context around Hyperforce. So this is a great read. Again, not like a short read, but not so bad. I definitely recommend anyone who is looking to understand more of how Salesforce works under the hood. This is an incredible resource. So if you, for example, want to understand how do different tenants different companies that use Salesforce, right? How do we manage their custom fields and separate out all those custom fields and custom objects that folks create? How do we store it? How do we separate it out under the hood? This goes into like what happens when you create a custom object, what happens when you create a custom field, and how do we store it in our database in Salesforce. So this can be really incredibly interesting, I think, just if you're a nerd like me, but also great understanding for you to have as anyone working on the platform. We go into things like indexes. Again, just a great thing to be aware of if you are not familiar with indexes. Definitely encourage you to do a little bit of reading. We talk about how data partitioning actually works. Like, how do we make sure data is not leaked out from different tenants or different customers? And then we get into I'll sort of browse past the platform application development. There's great stuff around no code, low code, query languages that we have, our APIs. But what I think, again, I'm definitely geek out about this a little bit. What I think is incredibly interesting is around how our queries work. So much of what we do, whether we're running a report or writing code to bring back data, depends on like query formation and how we use search on the platform. So we have a lot of information about how our queries actually work. And this is like a pretty simple diagram, but it's really interesting. This is actually what happens when you query data. So talking about like you request your data, then we run some pre-queries, then we have our query optimization process. Some of you might be familiar with the query optimizer, but this is actually like what happens under the hood. So lots of information. I won't go too far into the rest of it, but we have a lot of, or some information, I won't say a lot, some information on Hyperforce as well, compliance and trust that's been updated. Okay, so this is a wealth of information. There's a lot, but some of you might be wondering, how do I actually start to use this in my day-to-day? So for that, I want to hop back into slides and I want to show you an example of how to actually use some of what we've seen so far. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to solve problems fast using Salesforce Well-Architected. So this is how we are actually using. So we use Salesforce Well-Architected internally at Salesforce as well with our customers. We are working with a small subset of pilot customers right now. And this is how we're working with them. So we're using this 3-step process. We're essentially listening for symptoms. So this is for non-net new projects, so non-greenfield implementations. This is folks that are already have a Salesforce implementation up and running, and maybe they have an issue. So we are listening for symptoms. So an example of a symptom might be users giving some not so pleasant feedback, maybe some slow performance where you're experiencing what's called org throttling. So Salesforce is actually sort of limiting what you can do because of maybe you're trying to do too much with your resources that are allocated to you. Along the same line, maybe you're hitting some governor limits or some apex errors. So we're essentially listening for what's happening. And then we are using the anti-patterns inside Well-Architected to actually identify the root cause. So this is, I think, actually quite important when you think about how the alternative to solving problems, which I've definitely done in my work previously, which is not the fun way to do it. Sometimes you can feel a little bit like you're playing a game of like whack-a-mole. You're like, okay, well, there's an error. Just for example, an apex error. I can go and maybe look at the logs, look at the stack trace and see, oh, it's a problem on this line of code, okay? Once you fix that problem on that line of code, usually another problem, right, pops up and you're like working your way, you're solving like the immediate problem, but you're not getting to the root cause. So with Well-Architected, you can actually start to identify the relevant capability or behavior. So, a capability that we looked at was, for instance, like reliability. And maybe within that, there's a behavior like performance or availability. And you can go down even further and essentially get down to that table, right, of patterns and anti-patterns that we looked at to confirm if there's something in your org that is an anti-pattern. And once you identify that anti-pattern, you can sort of trace it back to how and where that symptom is showing up. And once you identify what is exactly the problem, you can start to correct it. And you can make sure that you're correcting the problem, again, with the resources that sort of correlate to what you're trying to do. So you're finding the anti-pattern and then you're refactoring it using maybe those tools and resources that we looked at in the table. So I think this is a great way to address urgent or maybe urgent to mid, I'd say like mid-tier, maybe like P0, P1 or 2 issues. But also on the step 3, number 4, what I think is incredibly powerful is when you're doing this work that I see, like Daniel, yeah, you're doing this normally every day. As you're doing your normal work of like fighting fires, essentially, with Well-Architected, you can also start to proactively spot these problems and maybe create user stories for less urgent issues. So maybe you're putting out this fire of an Apex error, but you see another anti-pattern that's popped up. Maybe it hasn't caused a symptom yet, but you can get ahead of it and start to make sure that you're not just waiting for the symptoms, you're actually proactively solving some of these problems before they become a problem that your users are actually seeing. So this is the 3-step sort of formula to follow. But if you're wondering, like, okay, that's interesting, but what does an example look like? Well, we have some examples of what that might look like in practice. So an example symptom might be that groups of users are saying a report is slow and it's showing data they don't need. So the way you would trace this back with Well-Architected to find the behavior that ties to the symptom would be to think through, okay, so we're talking about a slow report. We're talking about the system being slow. If I look at my Well-Architected, remember that one pager we started out the demo with all the different the headers and then all the things that are contained inside the headers, you would see latency optimization and think, okay, well, latency optimization is related to a slow system, and work your way back so that you understand, okay, this is related to performance, and let me go ahead and essentially look at the anti-pattern that exists inside my latency optimization behavior. And inside that anti-pattern, you'd find, if you look at that table again, that a report serving multiple purposes or containing extra rows is actually an anti-pattern that you want to avoid. And then, of course, for your tools and resources, if you track it back for latency optimization, you'd see that there's actually a query optimizer that you can make sure, and we actually mentioned this earlier, you can use query optimizer to make sure that you are having a performant query or a query that is essentially selective. And it's not querying the entire database. You're using things like indexes and all of those great tools to have a really performant query inside your report. So that's just one example. We have one for like worked in sandbox, but failing in production. How do you work back? And then some symptoms that are like even more, I guess, like maybe concrete. Like what happens if I'm getting my total number of DML statements is over the limit, or if I'm getting a SOQL query limit error. We can go through and again, use our behavior, find our anti-pattern, and then find the tool and resource to address that issue. So some of you might be wondering now. So you've seen the high-level framework. We saw a demo. We saw how to actually apply some of the tools that we reviewed. You might be wondering, well, maybe I have some great ideas that aren't well-architected yet. How do I get more involved? So to be very transparent, and this is, of course, Safe Harbor applies. This is what we are looking at on my team for this year for Well-Architected. So one of my priorities and one of the reasons I'm here with you today is to help drive adoption and enablement and awareness about Salesforce Well-Architected with all of you. And then also we want to make sure that we are continuing to mature and deepen those patterns and anti-patterns, those tables that we highlighted a couple of times. Also, we want to make sure that Well-Architected is more easy to use. I showed you at the beginning, I was like, this is a dense document, and you saw all the different sections. Right now, we are aware, we know that Salesforce Well-Architected is kind of hard to consume. It's a lot of text, it's a lot of documentation, but we are actively working on ways to make it more easy to use. And then also in the longer term, you'll see that we are discussing right now ways to bring this into our platform. So how do we make sure that you don't need to always do almost like a stare and compare, like look at the white paper and then look at your org? We want to bring it into your org more like there's the health check that exists inside Salesforce. In the longer term, our vision is to have some tooling inside Salesforce. So stay tuned for that. But where we need your input and contributions. So we would love to, if you want to present maybe an intro to Salesforce Well-Architected, if you run a user group, for example, you can reach out to me. I can put you in, plug you into the right resources so you have the deck and all that great stuff to run a session if you'd like. Also, we want to hear, this is where I would say, especially for you all who are working architects, who are in the field, seeing what's working, what's not working with your customers. We want to hear about the patterns you're seeing, the anti-patterns that you're seeing. So definitely use that feedback form on our white papers. We definitely want to hear your input. And I think with that, oh yeah, this is my friendly plug. And if you want to contribute content, if you are like, I have some great content that I think should be shared with the ecosystem, one of the best ways to get your content out there is to write for the Salesforce Architects blog. If you're interested, on architect.salesforce.com, there's a section for our blog, and we have a whole process. We have a calendar for when you could submit your blog drafts, when we review them, and tips and tricks on what type of content we're looking for. So this is definitely, we would love to feature your thought leadership on our blog. Definitely the easiest way, the quickest way to contribute. Okay. I think with that, yeah, my last slide, just a thank you. And then I think we're going to open it up for the rest of time for Q&A. So
Thank you, Susanna. That was an incredible presentation. I want to say I just loved one part, but I loved it all. I can't even put it into words. So insightful, and you went into such depth about everything. Every question I had, you answered it straight away. But speaking of questions, we are going to go on to our Q&A in just a few seconds. So if you want to pop any questions into the comment section, now's your chance. Susanna's going to be answering them. But yeah, what a presentation. I really enjoyed that. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm sure everyone is going to be a keen advocate for Salesforce Well-Architected now.
Awesome. Yeah, glad to see such a global representation. I saw all of you during your roll call. It was awesome. One of the things my team is, we're lucky to be able to, do a little bit of enablement, a little bit of traveling, but it's great to reach all of you through events like this. One of the things that we are going to be doing on July, and let me see, my calendar popped open on July 19th on LinkedIn, the Salesforce Architects team. So my team is going to be running our own live on maybe giving a little Dreamforce previews, some exciting information. So if you don't follow us on LinkedIn, this now would be a great time to follow Salesforce Architects on LinkedIn, and maybe I'll ping you the link, and we can get that in the chat as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. I feel like everyone's feeling the same as I did, and you just answered any questions that they might have straight away. But guys, make sure if you do have any questions, now's your chance. But I've just popped in Susanna's link, so if you want to connect with her and have any questions after the fact, then just follow that, and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer.
Absolutely,
Susanna,
happy to answer.
do you have any question? Oh, we've got one here. Is there any plan on including enterprise architect resources?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we have our enterprise architect team. I know there's some resources. There's like the capability cards that exist out there specifically for enterprise architect teams. But the content that's on the Well-Architected site, as well as on architect.salesforce.com, can be leveraged by all architects, I would say, especially our diagramming resources. Definitely something that you should take a look out for as an EA. If you are, speaking of diagrams, maybe no one asked, we didn't really talk about it, but I'll do a plug for Salesforce diagrams. If you are an architect or aspiring architect who is building a lot of diagrams and you need some guidance or templates, we have an entire template gallery. And for those of you who are already maybe using some diagramming tools, things like Lucidchart, Miro, Elements.cloud, we have partnerships with them, and our diagramming, what we call kit of parts, which is essentially like icons and templates, are going to be available in all three of those products, hopefully by Dreamforce. They're in Lucid and Elements.cloud today. Great question.
Sounds exciting. Yeah, great question. All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. Susanna, I want to thank you again for being an amazing panelist. I'm sure everyone enjoyed the LinkedIn Live as much as I did. Have you got any final words?
I think just thank you. Thanks so much for joining and learning a little bit about Salesforce Well-Architected. Maybe we can get the link to our LinkedIn in the chat before we all depart. But yes, just thank you so much. And I did see one question about diagrams. Any plan on partnering with Open Group IASA? We do not have any plans with that particular diagramming partner right now, but we are not this particular fiscal year, but in the future, we are looking to expand our partnerships. So definitely let us know what tools you're using, and we will figure out the next. Essentially, we try to see how we chose Lucid, just very transparently, that we did a survey and we found out that was the most popular diagramming tool for our audience, but we want to sort of see the next most popular. So let us know.
Perfect. Well, everyone, follow the link I just popped in the comments to find Salesforce Well-Architected LinkedIn. But thank you for everyone for joining us. And thank you, Susanna. We hope to see you all again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.